I'm Meg Whalen. I'm the Director of Communications and External Relations for the College of Arts and Architecture for Inside UNC Charlotte. The Projective Eye Gallery at UNC Charlotte Center City has a wonderful new exhibit on display through July 28th that brings together work of 4 faculty in the College of Arts and Architecture, 2 art faculty and 2 architecture faculty. And we're going to talk a little bit to a couple of the faculty about the installation work that is in that gallery. We have here first Tom Schmidt, who is professor in the Department of Art and Art History. And Tom, you worked with architecture professor Jefferson Ellinger.
That's right.
To do a work called Hybrid Skins.
That's right.
And then Janet Williams, another art professor, ceramics professor, and Thomas Forget, who is an architecture faculty member, worked together on a piece called Public Time.
Yes.
And so your piece is called Hybrid Skins.
That's right.
And tell me, what's the hybrid part?
So the hybrid part is we brought our 2 media together. So mine being the ceramics piece, his being more fiberglass reinforcement. And then once we saw the cracking happening and the way the fiberglass was transparent or translucent, then Jefferson had the thought, let's do some LEDs behind here. Let's bring light into this piece as well. So that was a 3rd piece into this sort of hybridity.
So let's talk a little bit about the process, because it was a very complicated multi-step process to create what appears to be sort of a simple, clean, multifaceted facade.
Yes. So it was a process that would bring Paul Stockhoff, who is currently a graduate student in architecture. He had been doing a lot of research using the robotic arm in order to bend steel and to bend aluminum. And he ended up developing this process to a point where it really allowed the steel to have these beautiful textures and beautiful evidence of the process. So we then used his steel models, we made plaster molds of them, then we slip cast porcelain into them, then we fire the porcelain, and in the fire and first in drying, then in the fire, and sometimes after the fire, the porcelain cracks, or we help instigate some of the cracks. And after that is when we fiberglass it.
And what's nice for the people who visit the gallery is that the process video that we can see now is also there in the gallery next to the installation, so that people can learn right then as they're seeing Hybrid Skins what went into into all of it.
When I think of the kind of conceptual piece, I keep coming back to this Japanese tradition of repairing cracked ceramics with gold enamel. It's called kintsugi, I believe, and it's this amazing tradition that is really trying to beautify what would otherwise be considered a flaw. And I think philosophically there's something quite lovely about that, and especially that we are doing a similar thing but using light instead of the gold luster is something that could only happen with the technology that we have available today.
And I love that interplay of purpose and chance and control and lack of control.
That's right.
And I think this work really does exemplify that, because on the one hand you've used a robot to create these molds that are so precise and so distinctive and everything, and then the ceramic, the cracks, you only have so much control over what they're going to look like.
That's right. There's a lot of chance, it's at a certain point you have to let go of that control. That's something that you learn in the ceramic arts, and I guess it just happens to work out that not having perfect control of a process is actually pretty fascinating. So.
Thank you, Tom, for joining us and telling us a little bit about Hybrid Skins. And I hope people will go to the Projective Eye Gallery and see it between now and July 28th. And next we will talk to Janet Williams, another member of our art faculty, who will tell us about Public Time. We're talking about Digital Dialogues, an exhibition at the Projective Eye Gallery at UNC Charlotte Center City that runs through July 28th. And we have Janet Williams, one of our ceramics professors, to talk about an installation that she and an architecture professor, Thomas Forget, have created called Public Time. But first, I just wanted, before we get into a description of that, I wanted to also mention that the grants from the Digital Arts Center that helped support your work and Tom Schmidt's and Jefferson Ellinger's work also were available to students in the departments of, I guess, the Department of Art and Art History and School of Architecture. Sure. And so I think 3 students were able to get grants, and they were art students Hannah Barnhart and Hamilton Ward, and architecture student Dean Crouch, and their work is visible in the front window case of the Center City building. So that's really nice that able to include students in this opportunity. So your piece is called Public Time, and it has a lot of different components that you and Thomas Forget put together. Tell me a little bit about the premise of the installation and then kind of what people will see there.
Okay, well, the initial dialogue between Thomas Forget and myself was really concerning Thomas's research, which has been a lot about the transport infrastructure in Charlotte, and particularly his interest in trains and filming of trains. My own work has been a little bit in the past with an interest in the landscape and topography, and we kind of both shared this idea of the way that the trains inscribe their movements across the land, and we wanted that kind of idea of a way of embedding maybe information or perhaps text or a language or data into material. So that was kind of the initial conversation, and it was left up to me to really think about experimenting with the material. And that's what I did. Thomas presented 2 different videos. One actually was focused on the trains and their movement across Charlotte. Mm-hmm. And the second video was train footage he chopped from different cities around the world. And his main interest, I would say, is in public transport and promoting public transport. He also presented a series of maps with different kind of rail and road intersections in Charlotte. And then we had a kind of digital display of some of the digital visualizations of the data.
And what is the data?
Well, the data essentially covered things like the movement and the motions of the trains, and we put digital sensors close to the tracks on the rail lines and on road and rail intersections. And the graduate students actually worked with that data to visualize it into some different forms.
How did you realize that in a material form?
Okay, so I was just presented with different images which I printed out and studied for a while, and I just picked for me the most compelling ones that I felt said something about motion, speed through time, space, how I could actually realize that into 3 dimensions.
So tell me what people will see then when they're in the gallery that you created.
So one of the processes, I had these images from the visualizations that looked like a series of columns or towers. Mm-hmm. And we actually printed out and cut with the laser cutter a series of shapes which were actually stacked to look like these towers, and they have the data kind of embedded into the surface. Eventually I did decide to display these as a series of tables, and I wanted to have something that echoed the train, so I actually made them long and narrow, a little bit like train tracks, and they were made of steel. Mm-hmm. Another table I focused on more of a topographic reading of the data. The data to me had suggested a kind of a topographic landscape. This time I used silicone rubber to actually make my molds. And that allowed me to cast different materials into the molds. And for the show, I actually cast concrete.
Yeah.
So the finished products on the table are 3 sections of this sort of topographic landscape, and they're in a concrete that's called rockite. The third table actually took a little bit of a different route. I was fascinated in some of the data with the way that it looked like strings joining points in space. And I thought, why not use strings? So I actually created 2 other pieces that were cut with the laser cutter again. One of them is a sort of series of parallel pieces which are shaped and actually have holes drilled through them. That allowed me to kind of follow the data lines and actually weave it through the material. And I did a second piece that was very similar to that. So the third table is kind of taken up with the string objects.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for telling
Okay.
us about the work, and thank you for joining us, and hope you'll stop by the Center City building and the Projective Eye Gallery between now and July 28th.